Welcome back to the Sidechat podcast. This week we'll be discussing the P-38, one of my longtime favorite aircraft. This is a very complex plane, and there's going to be a lot of information on it. We're going to split it into two halves, so this will be part one. We're going to cover basically from the P-38 to the P-38H, and then we'll do everything basically 1944 and on in the next podcast. Originally, the P-38 was an aircraft that was designed to do one thing, and it basically did everything. Originally, the aircraft was meant to go up and intercept incoming bombers. It was basically an aircraft meant to climb very quickly, carry a bunch of armament, and knock down bigger planes. It was never, ever designed or conceived to be a fighter-on-fighter aircraft, or even a ground attacker. The original contract for the P-38 was put out in January 1937. The Army wanted something that could go up and attack hostile aircraft at high altitude. It was supposed to go 360 mph at 20,000 feet. And go around 280 or 290 at sea level. For 1937 standards, climbing up to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes was insane, and the original P-38 prototype met all of these requirements. This aircraft was called the Model 22. Originally, it didn't have a military designation this time. It was called the Model 22 by Lockheed. Let's talk a little bit about Lockheed before World War II. Originally, they were a civilian aircraft company only. They had no military contracts to this point, to my knowledge, correct?
That's correct. That's small ones. I mean, nothing major.
They're an aircraft company that made basically planes, and for the most part, small numbers, very handmade, very, I don't know, call it high quality work.
Yeah, they kind of did two things. They built Amelia Earhart's airplane, the Electra, Lockheed 12 Electra. They also built this airplane called the Vega. That were basically, they were designed as mail planes both, but they ended up being racing planes. Lockheed was very big into flush riveting and cowlings and stuff like that when other aircraft design companies were still flying around in biplanes covered in fabric. They were well ahead of their time. Part of that is due to this guy named Kelly Johnson, who is the guy that designed the P-38. He's also the guy that designed the F-104, the U-2, the SR-71. He had a hand a little bit in the F-117, the very beginning of it. The guy was a freaking genius. Next to Ed Heinemann, he's probably the best aircraft designer this country's ever had, period.
Yep, there's actually two people designing the P-38 in the project. The other one was named H.L. Hibbard. That's a name that kind of gets lost in the history books.
Hal Hibbard is his name, yeah.
So I believe, though, Johnson was the one who originally drew up the plane.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, he was Lockheed's main designer for a long time. So most of the airplanes that Lockheed developed were of his design in some way, shape,
or his
form.
vision, and then Hibbard was the guy
who exactly
pushed the project along and everything.
Yep.
But the P-38 met all those requirements, like I said.
I have the list of the entire requirements here if you want.
Yeah, go for it.
Let's see, the Army Air Corps requirement was for an aircraft time to climb 20,000 feet in 6 minutes or less with a top speed of 360 miles an hour. Also required in the contract was the fuel capacity to fly at full throttle for at least 1 hour. They came up with a twin-engine design because that was the only airplane that could meet the 360 mile an hour and 1 hour requirement. The reason why the airplane is so streamlined is because it had to meet the 6 minutes to 20,000 feet. And that is all about speed in the climb. So everything is streamlined. Everything was covered originally. Everything was all fared over, and nothing stuck out at all. That's why it has such a distinctive shape.
Yeah, basically the design P-38, you have the engine, you have the prop, and then you have everything kind of built in behind it. So where on normal airplanes, parts that be in front, like it's very hard to explain. It constantly moves through the models too, where certain like oil coolers are, where the turbo intake is, where this is, kind of changes. Yeah. But everything was built in a straight line backwards instead of trying to pack it all around the engine or in other ways. Engine parts go much further back into the tail boom than you actually probably think. And then it just has this weird shape. That's how the P-38 came about. The aircraft was very heavy. That's something you have to say. And maneuverability was not a concern when they were designing it.
It's a very big airplane as well.
They went with two Allison V1710s. Basically, pretty much the only inline engine that America had to kind of choose from at that point that would work for this project. One thing to note is they had tricycle landing gear, which was very important for this aircraft. We're going to talk a bit about the armament configuration, which was very odd, very changing. Originally, the aircraft was supposed to have a 23mm Madison cannon with 50 caliber Colt MG53s. Then at some point, we'll talk about later, it changed to a 37mm, the same gun that's on the P-39. and then it had 2 versions of the Hispano put into it. But for the most part, it kept its 450s, and that main cannon changed. But like I said, that was an anti-bomber roll cannon to begin with. One thing to note about the P-38 is having all the guns in the nose has a very straight line. There's no convergence in the guns. Most American planes have their guns on the outside of the wings. And you basically have 1,000-yard straight shot of 450s and 120mm cannon. And American pilots like that. It's the only plane that really did that for the U.S. arsenal.
And it's also one of the few airplanes, but next to the C-47, what else? The ME-109. One of the few airplanes that was built from before the war to after the war, towards the end of the war, I should say. Only a handful of airplanes were built from 1939 on to 1945.
June 1937, the original XP-38 contract was given. It was for 1 plane. If the design worked, they would be ordering more. Lockheed saw this as a small order because if the contract eventually took, they saw maybe a max of 50 planes in 1938. So, this was pre-war America. They didn't think that they would need thousands of these things. So they took a very hands-on, high-quality approach to this, which kind of screwed the project over later down the road when they had to mass-produce this thing. The P-38 was ahead of its time in many ways. One of those ways is counter-rotating propellers. Originally, I believe the prototype, the XP-38, had its propellers turn inward.
Normally, yes, yeah.
And that was to do a couple things. There's something called tail buffeting, which a lot of planes suffered with in early design. You want to talk a little bit about tail buffeting?
Well, basically, the propellers make a corkscrew, and if it's turning the wrong way, like if it's turning in, it'll make a corkscrew, and that corkscrew effect of the air will end up hitting the tail, and basically it's like someone bouncing a basketball next to you the entire time. It's very unnerving. It makes the airplane rock. What they did is they swapped the props to turn them the other way, so that they would turn outward, so that they wouldn't hit the inside of the fuselage. Pretty smart.
Yeah, having the propellers turn outward actually makes the aircraft faster, they found too. This wasn't done, counter-rotating props for twin-engine planes wasn't really done until the 60s or 70s with commercial airliners. This thing was way ahead of its time for doing this, and the main reason most companies stayed away from doing this was it's hard to, instead of one part for both engines, now you need separate parts. You need an Allison engine that turns this way, you need a propeller that does this, and
that's correct. Yeah, you need 2 physically different engines, 2 physically different propellers. You need one that turns left and then one that turns right. Right's normal here in the U.S. and in Russia, left is normal. So here in the U.S., all of our engines turn to the right. So they needed one that was a mirror image of that. So there's different part numbers, which means you have to stock different parts, which means you have to find different parts, which can be a pain in the ass in the battlefield.
So the original XP-38 weighed 14,800 pounds, which is a heavy aircraft, especially for then. It first flew in 1938. It had Fowler flaps, which we're going to talk about real quick and probably the only time. Fowler flaps are like normal flaps, except they kind of extend, I guess you'll probably explain it better than I can, kind of out and then downward.
Yeah, Fowler flaps were designed by a guy named Fowler, of course. They basically go out on a track before they head down. So instead of them curving down as soon as they open up, they go out and actually extend the chord of the wing first before they drop down. Pretty good idea.
Yeah, they basically handle better at high speed.
Yep.
It helps the plane like this. A Fowler flap basically kind of saves a P-38, basically making it turn better. Similar planes with this type of system are, it's why the Firefly turns so well, it's why the P-43 turns so well. Planes that had flaps on tracks and do different things like this had a huge advantage over other planes that didn't, and I don't quite understand why more planes didn't experiment with different types of flaps during the war.
It was very complex to build that stuff.
The original XP-38 did have a Fowler flap. One of the linkages failed during landing, so they had to have a hard landing because they had the flaps were up. That's just noticing that it's a complex system. Anyway, the aircraft was only in existence for like 2 weeks, like 13 days. The Army realized that they had an aircraft that does close to 400 mph, and they wanted to show the world that they had something new and shiny. So Lockheed didn't get to do very much testing. The Army didn't get to do very much testing. They immediately said, let's set a transcontinental speed record, and it crashed on the first leg of it. And the pilot basically undershot the runway. Airplane was lost, and that set back the P-38 project so far. Stupid press stunt kept the P-38 out of World War II for a little while. The other part that's important to notice about the XP-38 being lost is they had The aircraft was built by hand. They didn't have another one of these. They didn't have the ability to test things. They had to build the second one from scratch again, and that was going to take some time. So April 1939, 13 YP-38s were ordered. YP-38 is a pre-production model. Those were going to be limited service testing models. 5 months later, 66 planes were ordered for operational service. And then August 1940, 607 more planes were ordered. The problem was that they didn't build one YP-38 yet. So they have almost 700 planes ordered, and they still don't have number 2 built. Building the aircraft from hand, they had many problems. One of the things they had to do was a complete structural redesign of the aircraft on how to make it easier to mass produce. One thing I want to say real quick about the Army at this time, which I was actually reading into, was the Army would take one design and they basically say, we want to go with this aircraft. Like they went with the P-40. But they also cleared the P-39 for service because they wanted to have a backup design ready in case something happened to the P-40. And in the P-38's case, the XP-50 was kind of greenlit to put more pressure on Lockheed and have a backup in case the P-38 project failed. Another thing that held back production of the P-38 was that Lockheed just did not have the manufacturing space to build all these aircraft. They actually went down the street. They met a guy who made whiskey during lunch. They gave him $20,000, bought his distillery, and moved the factory down the road. And you can see pictures of P-38s basically being built outside in Burbank. I believe it was Burbank, or was...
Yep, Burbank. Yep, Burbank, California. Yep, right at the Burbank Airport. Or what is now the Burbank Airport, I should say.
When they finally got P-38s produced, the production models were actually hitting combat while the YP-38s were still being tested. That's how much of just a frenzy this aircraft was early on. 36 P-38Ds were produced in August of 1941. That's kind of the first operational one. P-38,
the U.S.
Yeah, P-38A through C never existed. P-38D did have some new features, self-sealing fuel tanks. They switched out the high altitude oxygen pressure system for a low altitude oxygen system. They put in new armor plating. They added retractable landing lights. What are some things? They put in provisions for dropping flares. And the aircraft was supposed to be armed with a 37mm cannon and 450s. 37mm cannons were in massive short supply for the P-39. So the P-38D, to my knowledge, never had one installed. They just flew with the 450s.
And they were supposed to have the 20mm Hispano. But I don't even know if they even got those. The airplane was modified to accept the 20mm Hispano instead, but I don't believe they were ever actually delivered with the cannons, period. I think it was just all machine guns.
Now, this is where P-38 information gets super hazy, Cobey read a book, I read a book. I have 2 different books here. They both fight each other on this. You go different internet sources. Nobody has a clear-cut picture of this time frame for the P-38. There's so much misinformation and probably just not a lot's known because it was just chaos. The P-38D was originally known as the Lockheed Atlanta. When the British took delivery of it, they called it the Lightning I, and the Army liked that name better, so they picked up the P-38 Lightning. That's where that came from. I believe the Lightning I was a P-38E, and very few were actually delivered. Funny part is they were fitted with older Allison V-1710s, not the newest ones. And since we didn't have enough turbo superchargers, they basically were delivered with nothing.
Yep, just straight out exhaust. No, just a naturally aspirated engine. Nothing special at all.
They call these aircraft castrated Lightnings.
They also didn't have counter-rotating propellers as well.
The British pilots said these planes were pleasant to fly, they were not very maneuverable, and they were speed restricted because they had a little problem that we're going to get to later about compressibility and some other issues. Most planes were built for the British were actually absorbed back into U.S. as trainers or back as testing aircraft. Some of these airplanes found their way to Dallas where they were modified into 2-seat trainers, and this is very sketchy. They removed a bunch of stuff out of the back, and they basically shoved in a seat, and the instructor would basically fetal position the back of the P-38 and...
Well, there isn't very much information on it, but basically the instructor was just there for the ride and hoped to hell that the guy sitting in front of him actually flying the airplane didn't kill him. That's basically it.
The other problem was that with the P-38 canopy, it basically made a greenhouse for the poor guy in the back, and he basically cooked.
Yep.
20 of these were modified to that. Then we have the 37mm. I talked about the P-38E, 210 of those made. This was the first aircraft to get the Hispano cannon, the 20mm cannon installed that we know of. Some of these were set aside for testing, some became trainers, and then 99 of them were converted to unarmed recon aircraft. So once again, there's a bunch of P-38Es made, and then they go a bunch of different directions. And the history of where all these aircraft ended up is very, very kind of hazy. I don't have those records in front of me. I don't think anybody does. You want to talk a bit about the F4s, where they were called, the unarmed
There's
P-38s?
two versions. Yeah, there's two versions of the Photo Lightning. The F4, which is based on the earlier model fuselage, and the F5, which is based on the J model fuselage. There's a million different varieties of F4s and F5s. There's an F4A, F4B, F5A, F5B, yada, yada, yada. The reason why the Air Force chose the P-38 as a reconnaissance airplane is because it's very easy to swap out the guns in the nose, and they could put cameras in there. The cameras were not restricted by the airframe at all, because they could look straight ahead, straight down, and straight to the side and have nothing in the way, which is nice. Plus the speed too. The airplane was pretty freaking fast. That's what you need in a photo reconnaissance airplane, is fast speed, so you can fly over the target quickly, get back to base, get your photos developed. The F5s and the F4s were built in conjunction with whatever happened to be being built at the time. The only differences were in the nose. If they did an improvement to the P-38, it was automatically rolled into the F4 and F5 line at the exact same time. Basically, think of a production line where you're building airplanes. Every so often, one will just be a reconnaissance airplane instead of a regular P-38. P-38s were loved by the recon pilots too.
So that's why it was just range and speed. That's why the P-38 was big advantage early on. The first P-38 to actually see combat or any action was the F4. But remember, this P-38 had no armament. A bunch of Zeros caught him near New Guinea. They dove on him. They shot him up. He lost his, I think, number 2 engine and was able to fly home on one engine and still basically outrun the Zeros with one engine down. And so that aircraft survived. I know War Thunder doesn't paint the P-38 as a very robust and kind of sturdy aircraft. It just kind of blows up whenever it's hit. In real life, there's several accounts of P-38s taking a lot of damage and taking their pilots home. There's one case, and of course this is just one case. I'm not saying every time somebody collided with P-38, the P-38 flew through it. But there is one story I want to tell where a 109 pilot and a P-38 pilot were basically going head-on. Both of them didn't wave off. The P-38 struck into the right wing. The 109 basically busted into 1,000 pieces. The P-38 lost its propeller and some other stuff. The aircraft was able to fly its pilot, the aircraft was able to fly back home. It landed. Of course, it was scrapped for spare parts, but it didn't just blow apart. And then War Thunder, the aircraft would have been in 1,000 pieces. So please, there's several things in War Thunder that that are not correct about the P-38. So please don't let, little disclaimer, please don't let the game shape your vision of this aircraft.
Yeah, it's a much better airplane in real life than it ever has been in the game, probably ever will be in the game.
First P-38 to successfully engage enemy was over somewhere near Iceland, and they found a Condor, and the Condor did not have a good time. P-38s also knocked down several Japanese flying boats near the Aleutian Islands. That's the action that saw up there. Like I said, most of these were probably E's. And then we have P-38F, which is the first kind of combat-worthy Lightning, and that came into service February of 1942. It saw most of its action in North Africa, and we're going to talk a little bit about the North Africa campaign. This is where the P-38 started having records of it having some compressibility issues and kind of crashing straight into the ground. I've always heard stories of P-38s, basically 109s, they would dive away because the P-38 could not follow it. And that's true, and several things happened, and the issue was actually a lot more complex than I ever knew. Basically what happened is the aircraft would reach 425 mph to 500 miles per hour. It would violently disturb the air going over the wing, and then no air was getting over the wing properly, so your control surfaces and your lift was disappearing on you. It's going to continue to dive more and more and more and more, and then the aircraft hits that basically terminal velocity and just blows itself apart, or you just go into the ground. Lockheed had a hell of a time finding this issue because not every aircraft did this. It was only some P-38s, it seemed. They'd have production models that they would fly and purposely have their test pilots do this, and then it would work fine. And then the next one wouldn't. And so it was very intermittent problem. They spent a lot of time in several wind tunnels to find this issue. They went over to Europe and they went, North Africa. They tried everything they could to find this issue. Finally, they all kind of came up with the same solution that they needed an air brake about 30% back from the wing. I'm sorry, they needed a dive recovery flap about 30% back from the wing that would save the aircraft from doing this. Hibbert and Johnson suspected this problem early on.
Yeah, it was first demonstrated in the XP-38.
And since the XP-38 was lost in 13 days, they never had a chance to explore this issue more. This is, once again, that stupid transcontinental speed run probably killed some American pilots later on. This is, that one mistake by a press guy really cost him in the future. But there is a letter from Hibbert explaining all these issues I talked about, and that's kind of what I'm referencing with the 425 mile per hour notations. It was from his letter. So the other kind of funny part is the dive recovery flaps didn't really show up on the P-38s until the middle of the J series. In 1942, the solution was found, though, and they built 425 sets of dive flap modifications for all the P-38s in service. All these were built with high priority. They were all put on a C-54 transport plane. It flew from the U.S. to the island of Britain, where a Spitfire pilot shot it down. All of the dive recovery flaps were lost in the ocean forever. So, oops. So the P-38J-25 model was the first one to get dive recovery flaps. Essentially, the F and the G and the H could have all had them.
Oh, it was life.
Yep.
Yeah, it finally was solved in the late J's, and on the L's. The L's it came standard with, and the compressibility finally went away. Basically, what the dive brake does is it basically breaks up that barrier of dead air that surrounds the wing and gets the wing flying back again. It was controlled by a button on the yoke that you could punch it out immediately instead of having them like move a flap handle or anything like that. When you need it, you can just press the button and they would come out electrically.
Yeah, it was electrically powered, not hydraulic. I want to also notice that it was also in a different system than the hydraulic control or any of the hydraulics. But let's get back to the P-38F. 527 were built February of 1942. They had improved engines. You're going to see me say this a lot. They had improved engines. I'm not going to go into every change with the V1710 and turbo superchargers. Technology was moving very quickly. Every time they could put a new improvement of an engine, they would put it in. So it might be 50 horsepower, 200 horsepower. The V1710 was making leaps and bounds every month, basically, or year. There was external sockets for ground power to start the engines. That was added on that one. There's also new filters added for operating in the desert. It had new combat radios, and there's also some other things like experimental fuel tanks or the ability to bomb. So the aircraft could hold 1,000 pounds on each pylon, which is insane.
Yeah, the F was the first model to carry external stores on the outside of the airplane instead of just the machine guns. They could also carry bombs, basically. They could also carry external fuel tanks. In fact, I think the fuel tanks came in 3 or 4 different sizes, and they were all designed by Kelly Johnson himself.
And then there's a whole bunch of crap since it's Lockheed and they have to make a bunch of accessories for airplanes. There's a ton of crap that they did that was just completely not necessary. The P-38F was tested with two 22-inch torpedoes because, just in case you want to sink a Japanese destroyer on the way back home.
Well, yeah, the Navy at the time was considering a navalized version of the P-38, and so that's why it was going to carry torpedoes.
It also had a smoke lane generator installed for testing. It had a gas spring generator installed. Of course, this did not hit production. This was all testing. And then my favorite is it had retractable skis for Arctic operations. And these were, and I was actually reading into these skis. They're very handmade and specialty skis. They're Lockheed skis. They're very expensive. They're, multiple layers of different woods from the finest trees that they could find in Northern Cali. But these were tested. You can see some pictures of them being tested. The test did not go very well. I believe that one actually rolled over. It was very hard to taxi a P-38, evidently, with skis on. So these were, I believe, these skis were never used operationally. The Fowler flaps, though, were added with a special feature on this aircraft. So if you're going up to 250 mph, you could hit a button. This is the only time in any reference I've ever seen anything kind of talk about combat flaps. We all see combat flaps in War Thunder. You hit F, and then your flaps go down to a magical degree. This is the only time I've actually seen an aircraft actually have something close to a combat flap with a preset button like this. You hit a button, it went to 8 degrees for up to 250 mph, and that greatly helped the maneuverability of the P-38. Usually you had to manually move the flap to the degree you wanted. Yeah, let's get into P-38G for a little bit, and then we'll go back to basically talk about the F and G together. The P-38 models, there's not one that did this or one that did that, so let's real quickly talk about the G and the H, and then we'll talk about the combat service to keep away from as much confusion as possible. This aircraft is kind of hard to keep straight. The P-38G was delivered with about 1,082, had improved engines. Like I said, I'm not going to go into those details. Had a new oxygen system, had a lamp installed. Did you know that?
A lamp inside the cockpit?
Yeah, lamp, yeah.
Oh, that's smart.
Had new gauges, had 3,200 pounds of bombs, so it was basically starting to rival the B-17. Had more fuel capacity, so the aircraft ran under the right conditions, could have an endurance of nearly 10 hours. And then the aircraft also had special streamlined containers that could carry equipment or 1 to 2 wounded soldiers on stretchers underneath it. I don't know, I haven't been able to find a picture, though, of that capsule.
Yeah, neither have I looked. I can't find anything at all. I don't know if it was just experiment. It's got to be just experimental.
The P-38H rolled around in May 1943, 610 made. Once again, improved engines, improved turbo superchargers, fully automatic engine controls. This is a big deal for it. Basically, as the aircraft went higher or lower, it would open or close the oil radiator flaps.
Oil, yeah, it was automatic with the oil coolers and the turbo superchargers as well.
One of the problems that the U.S. had with their pilots is that they weren't being trained properly, or just oversights. You don't think about opening or closing your flaps properly. The P-38 was very prone to overheating, and one mistake, and then boom, you're kind of done. The P-38H was also the first aircraft to have the A&M 2C replace the M1 model of the cannon. Same ammo count, so it's not a very big deal, but the 20mm cannon was upgraded as well. The P-38F saw action primarily as escort fighters. Once again, like I said, this aircraft was designed as an interceptor, not an escort fighter, but it's what it saw in North Africa. Why it got the role of escort fighter was basically range. The P-40 did not have the range of the P-38, and so it could fly with the B-17s basically almost all the way there and back. That's North Africa, not Europe. The P-38s, I want to talk about real quick. This is kind of a funny story. Originally, one of the problems that the U.S. had was getting the P-38s to Europe and North Africa. At the time, we were having trouble getting planes across the ocean. They decided that the P-38's range, we could probably fly it across, so they went to Canada, and then they tried to kind of hop, skip, and jump through Greenland and a couple other places into the UK. It did not go very well. They decided that they'd have one B-17 be a mothership, the 6 P-38s, and then it'd be a navigator and 2 pilots. So there's no gunners, no bombs or anything on board. Due to either weather or the Germans would jump them, the Germans thought this was great. They'd send random flights of 109s or whatever out into the path to try and jump these guys. Or radios failed and people got lost. So they decided it was better just to ship the P-38s on cargo ships or tankers.
Also carriers too.
Yeah, I don't know when they actually started shipping those things on carriers. It's kind of a weird aircraft to, it's not. It's kind of a weird aircraft to pack on a carrier deck or inside of a carrier.
Yeah. Well, you can't take it apart. That's probably half the reason. Is that.
So they shipped it from that forward point on. So, like I said, the P-38 did a lot of escort fighting, or the P-38 did a lot of escort service. This is where the nickname, the Fork-tailed Devil, kind of came into play, was the German pilots saw the aircraft, and that's where that nickname started, was in North Africa. The pilots were very green versus the very veteran German pilots who saw, Battle France and Poland and Battle Britain, and our pilots saw nothing. So the P-38 had a lot of trouble kind of starting off in North Africa, like I said, the pilots, and then there weren't enough airplanes that then make it or produced. And there was also poor maintenance. It was hard to find parts out in the desert. It was hard getting parts to them. And to make everything worse, commanders started assigning random missions to the P-38s, like strafing runs, bombing runs, air superiority, fighter roles. Just to give you a kind of example of this, there was one strafing run that 6 P-38s flawlessly attacked a German column of armor. When they were coming back at night, they decided not to use their landing gear. When they were coming back at night, they decided not to use their landing lights because they did not want the enemy 109s to see where they were landing, and they all were lost due to the darkness. No.
Not very smart.
I think you can throw that to the being green and untrained or paranoid part. The biggest thing, though, the P-38s actually gave the North African front was the ability to disrupt Axis transport planes flying over the ocean. The P-40 was not going to be flying over water very far. The Spitfires weren't. The Hurricanes weren't. the P-38 could actually go out there and shoot down, I believe it was Ju-52s, by the droves. And interrupting the German supply of troops and parts was massive. Another thing I want to point out real quick, though, is that the P-38 did not have stellar success as a escort role for protecting B-17s. P-38, like we said, can fly up to nearly 380 mph, 400 mph, and so on. A B-17 does not fly anywhere close to that. So P-38 would actually have to slow down to sit next to the B-17s. 109s would jump them. You know, you're going slow in a heavy fighter. It's not very maneuverable. Quite a few P-38s were lost. But basically all Bomber Command cared about was more B-17s were getting through with P-38s helping than weren't. So one P-38 or two P-38s or three P-38s were worth one B-17 to U.S. Command. And I think you have to evaluate also human life, right? I mean, it's one or two or three pilots in exchange for two pilots and a B-17 crew. Was that kind of the thinking?
Yeah. I mean, there's 10 guys on a B-17, so you lose three P-38s. That's 30 people not dead in a B-17.
Real quickly, I want to talk about the early P-38s versus the early 109s. 109 pilots stated that it was very hard to catch P-38s. There's several accounts where 109s were basically the altitude. They see the P-38 below them. The P-38s never saw the 109. They would dive onto the back of the 109 would dive to the back of a P-38, take it shot. P-38 pilot would just apply a weapon and be gone. It was very hard for the 109s to catch P-38s that decided not to engage. While the P-38 pilots just constantly complained about how unmaneuverable and heavy the aircraft was whenever they tried to fight the 109. So each aircraft had its kind of plus or minus. The P-38 really didn't get on par with the 109 until the G6. The G6 was very heavy, and that was kind of one of the not shining stars of the 109 line. So the G6 got very kind of heavier, and the P-38 kind of stayed the same. The P-38 was also developed into a bomber. Bombing sights were added, and they also had special fuse-delayed bombs for skip bombing in North Africa. Once P-38s arrived in large enough numbers and with experienced pilots, the aircraft did start to turn around. The numbers started turning around for the air-to-air combat roles and so on. So I think the P-38 kind of G was a much better aircraft than the F, and that's also where you saw the pilots improve. Everything improved with P-38G. The pilots, the parts, the plane, and so on. P-38 saw a lot of action throughout the Mediterranean, and eventually they joined up with the 15th Air Force, escorting heavy bombers from England into France and Germany. The P-38H arrived in England around the summer of 1943, and we're going to cut it off right there. We're going to talk a bit about the Pacific, and then we'll talk about the later P-38s on the next podcast. So the Pacific Theater is completely different than North Africa Theater, obviously. The Pacific Command wanted P-38s because they needed to cover large areas between the bases. Pacific is very...
Yeah, they needed the range of the airplane.
Another advantage of the P-38 was it ran 2 engines versus 1. Whenever you're flying over open water, you really like to have the ability to have an extra engine in case something happens. There's a lot of accounts. The P-38 was kind of an interesting matchup for the Zero. Same reason for the 109. P-38 could outrun a Zero all day, every day. But the Zero obviously outmaneuvered the P-38 and so on.
They were mostly used in the Pacific, like you said, because the range of the airplane was needed for island hopping. It was just a good airplane. That's really it. I mean, it was, of course, in the J and the L models, it became a vastly superior airplane, but Richard Bong, who was the highest scoring ace of the war, flew a P-38 pretty much exclusively. He got most of his kills in J's, but started out actually in an F model in New Guinea, I think is where he started flying. He really, really, really liked the P-38. In fact, I remember reading it somewhere where he actually liked the early model P-38s better than the J and the L.
Did a lot of recon work in the Pacific Theater as well, trying to take pictures of islands and fighting enemy ships and this and that. The thing was a workhorse until eventually until aircraft like the Hellcat and the Corsairs kind of flooded that theater. The P-38 was basically a stopgap aircraft. It was the only thing they could get over there in decent numbers to kind of fight back against the Japanese Navy and Army. I know it escorted quite a few B-24s over in that theater eventually too, and it just saw it work everywhere. I don't have any specific instances. We're going to probably talk more about the Pacific Theater in the next podcast because I know those late models, like you said, the J, saw a lot of action in that theater. If you have any questions, anything we skipped over, anything you want to know more about, please ask. This is such a complex aircraft. I hope this painted a little bit of a picture. We can go a lot more in the details, but I wanted to kind of keep the information to what we felt was important. If you have any J or L footage that you'd like to share, you can send me a replay at bohicaice@gmail.com. The replays you saw in this video are from users that submitted them. If you have some gameplay you'd like to show off, feel free to send it in. So thank you for listening, and thank you to all the guys who submitted replays for this podcast. We will see you in a week or two with the part 2 part of the series.